Hello, everyone. Thank you for being here. I have the honor to be here with you. I'm going to co-facilitate this panel today with a colleague. So my name is Mariama Diallo, and I am a co-program director from Sanctuary for Families.
And greetings, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us. And thank you, Sanctuary for Families, for organizing this with ODIHR. My name is Taina Bien-Aimé, and I am the Executive Director of the Coalition Against Trafficking in Women, and thrilled to be here with all of our illustrious panelists. So thank you.
Thank you, Taina. So 20 years ago, I have attended my first conference on gender-based violence organized by the United Nations. I left really energized and hopeful because of what I have heard from the panelists. But again, today we are still talking about these different types of gender-based violence that is on a spectrum, right? These are abuses that are perpetrated just on the basis of the gender. It could be intimate partner violence, it could be honor killing, labor and sexual trafficking, female genital mutilations, early forced marriage, and femicide. Just to give you an idea how prevalent these issues are, around the world, about 200 million girls and women have been subjected to female genital mutilations. And between 30 and 40% of women worldwide have been subjected to either physical and or sexual violence. About 24 million victims are trapped in modern day slavery. Among them, 64% were exploited for labor, 19% were sexually exploited. In 2016, 15 million people were forced into marriage. 88% of them were women and girls, and 37% of the victims were under the age of 18. In 2017, a total of 87,000 women were intentionally killed, and 50% of these women were killed by an intimate partner or a family member. So this is to tell you how prevalent these problems we're going to talk about today is. Gender-based violence is a pandemic. And we know, again, the COVID-19 pandemic made things worse for victims and survivors. These different types of abuse we're going to talk about today are all intertwined. You will hear this from our speakers. Some can experience more than one of these types of abuse and more than once. So when we're talking about intersectionality between gender-based violence, we have to think about the complex of trauma survivors of these abuse have to face. That's one. And number two, the challenges they can face also to access needed services as victims or survivors. These challenges sometimes happen because the system where they turn to when there is a problem, these systems are failing them. However, I have to tell you that I'm really thankful to know that there are amazing people out there, including our speakers today, who are standing up and say enough is enough and working around the clock to make sure these type of abuse are not tolerated anymore. So just before we start the panel, I want to give the attendees a few housekeeping tips. So we're going to give our panelists time to answer 2 questions and then to speak, in fact. And then at the end of the panel, the participants have an opportunity to ask all the questions. On the bottom of your screen, you're going to see a Q&A and a chat. So please put your questions in the Q&A and we will come back to that. And without any further delay, I have the honor to introduce our speakers. We have Sebiye Coşkun, who is a healthcare professional, and a women's rights advocate. And we have Kika Cerpa, an anti-sex trafficking advocate. And we have Jaha Dukureh, a founder of Safe Hand for Girls. We have Jacqueline Franchetti, Kyra's mom and founder of Kyra's Champions. And we have Fraidy Reiss, founder of Unchained at last. Thank you all for being here. And I'm going to start with the questions. Question number one will go to Kika. Kika, you can unmute yourself. And the question is, tell us about intersecting forms of gender violence as they impact human trafficking survivors.
Good morning. I'm Kika Cerpa. I'm the mother of 3 wonderful daughters and a grandmother, a worker in a tech industry, an advocate and a survivor of sex trafficking. I'm also the life partner of a loving woman, Maria, who has supported me in my journey from victim to survivor. Like so many trafficking victims, my exploitation started with sexual abuse in my childhood. Abandonment by my family and abuse by a boyfriend, I ended when I married a customer who subjected me to domestic violence. I was born and raised in Caracas, Venezuela. My father has abandoned my mother when I was a baby. And my 9 brothers and sisters and I grew up in poverty. Like most trafficking victims, expert estimates as many 90% I suffered sexual violence as a child. The details are too traumatic to share, but the experience left me deeply traumatized at 8 years old. From that point on, I live in fear. At 14, I met a boy. At first, he treated me well, but soon he turned abuser. I found myself carrying a baby when I was still a child myself. My mother threw me out. Alone and desperate, I gave birth to my oldest daughter. There was an angel in my life, my grandmother. With support and encouragement, I finished high school. I started bookkeeping and found a good job at the Hilton Hotel in Caracas. There was a man, Daniel, who offered me love and protection. I did not know that he was a member of a family that made its money from sex trafficking. Daniel lured me to New York, promising me a wonderful new life. Once I arrived, he and his cousin Sandra put me into a debt bounder, helped me my travel documents, and brutally trafficked me in a massage parlor. Managed by Sandra, they used my status as an undocumented immigrant as a tool of control, constantly threatening me that I would be deported and reported if I reported the abuse. For 3 devastating years, I was sexually assaulted over and over by buyers. I witnessed one murdered, another trafficking victim. Today, I cannot believe that I survived this ordeal. I was desperate to escape, but saw no exit. Instead of protecting me, local police sexual assault me and arrest me. Eventually, a customer told me he wanted to marry me. He proposed by holding a gun to my stomach and threatened me to kill me if I didn't say yes. I married him. I had no choice. And soon I have 2 little girls. My husband's violence got even worse. They were frequent beating and constant threatening and verbal abuse. I finally fled into a shelter for the victim of domestic violence with my daughters. The shelter staff urged me to go to a court to get an order of protection. My husband was there waiting for me. He told the judge I was a prostitute, and the judge gave him a custody of my girls. An advocate for victims of domestic violence was in the courtroom and referred me to lawyers of Santario for family. They helped me get custody of my daughters, divorce my husband, vacate my criminal conviction, and get legal immigration status. But Maria, who offered me a stable home, not only for me, but for my daughter, and gave me back my life. As an advocate for trafficking survivors, I learned that sex trafficking starts with almost always involve different forms of gender violence. Each form of abuse intensifies the victim trauma and vulnerability. Each form of abuse strengthens the abuser control and make it harder for the victim to escape. Police corruption enables sex industry to make more and more profit, attracting new traffickers, pimps, and buyers. It must stop. Police officers must carefully increase abuser like my ex-husband do not enter up in the police force. Once the police officer must be trained about harm done by the sex industry, and they must be close monitored so that any force of engagement sex buyer or harassed prostitution women are arrested and fired. Immigrant trafficking victims need inspection, protect, and assistance.
Thank you, Kika. Thank you so much for sharing your journey. Your experience of abuse, it's not only from an intimate partner, it's also from other family members. And it started at a very young age. But again, as you said, you survived. You survived. What a resiliency. We will come back with the follow-up questions because we would love to know more. We would love to learn from you more. Thank you again. So our next panelist is it's going to be Sebiye.
Okay, hello.
You can, yes, you can unmute yourself. Thank you, Sebiye. Okay. So the question I have for you is, you are a survivor of honor-related violence and other forms of gender-based violence. Could you explain how they intersect and how they undermine the safety and freedom of women and affect their health and well-being?
Yes, I have been reflecting a lot about this. This has followed the story of another Turkish survivor. You may have heard about her case. Melek İpek from Antalya killed her severely abusive husband after he beat, raped, and threatened to kill her and her 2 young daughters. She shot her husband with his gun in order to save her life and the lives of her daughters. When she was arrested, she had a black eye and laceration on her temple. But instead of investigating her self-defense claim, the government arrested her and prosecuting her for the murder. Women in Turkey are killed by their abusive intimate partner at shockingly high rates. And Turkey has especially high incidence of the woman suicide that are not investigated. The Turkish government reported that 266 women are killed by intimate partner abusers in Turkey last year alone. But women's rights groups say that real number is way high. There is a special feature of Melek İpek's situation that parallels my own history. It is a form of the oppression and abuse that many women in traditional part of the Turkey and in other traditional part of the world face. Although Melek was an excellent student who dreamed of to become a math teacher, her husband raped her while she was a teenager, and she was forced to marry him. If she had refused, her own family might have turned on her, violating their honor as mine did. Like Melek, I was an excellent student and had a dream of the professional success and helping others. As a girl, I wanted career in medicine, and the only available career as a girl was becoming a nurse. When I was 13, I won prestigious scholarship to study nursing. At 18, I was offered a job as a registered nurse at the hospital in Ankara, some distance from my family's home. I traveled there and began my new job. It was the most thrilling time in my life. At the first, I had a female roommate, but she moved back. She moved back home, leaving me alone. While that might not be a problem if I had lived in New York or London. In Turkey, woman alone is moving target. A man realized that I was by myself and began to pursue me. He kept asking me to meet with him at the restaurant, hoping that I would stop pestering me if I agreed with him. I finally met with him in the coffee shop. He gave me soft drink that contained a strong sedative. He took me to secluded location and I passed out. While unconscious, he raped me. After he raped me, he began to abuse and blackmail to me. If I didn't enter into the relationship with him, he threatened to tell my family and my parents and my family that I was no longer virgin and I was a bad woman. My reputation would be destroyed, so would my family's. My father was a very prominent farmer, and our family's honor was incredibly important to him, and also including all my and other family members. The police in my region took young women who were suspected of losing their virginity to hospitals to conduct virginity tests. I knew that my community, and law enforcement authorities would turn on me if they learned I was no longer virgin. I had no choice. I had to marry my rapist and bother it. He wanted to move to the United States. I had no choice. I had to follow him here. When I arrived in the United States, my husband's violence became even worse. I got pregnant, we had a child, but unfortunately made no difference to my husband. The violence escalated. Finally, I fled with my baby into the victim of domestic violence shelter. First time in my life, for the first time in a long time, I felt so good in the domestic violence shelter system. And also I was feeling so safe. But my husband, he wanted revenge for my leaving him. He called my parents. He told him that he caught me with another man, and I was living as a prostitute in the United States. My own family told me that they wanted to kill me, and this is the only way they could save their honor. Fortunately, I was luckily quickly connected to lawyers at Center for Families who represented me in case of my asylum case. I was granted permanent resident status, then citizenship. Although my husband, he tried to take custody from me, and he tried to take my son away from me. But my lawyers, thank you very much for the Dorchen, she helped me to retain my custody. Finally, my husband, he gave up and found another woman who married married and had children with. I learned that he was abusing her, and she fled. She fled, fought for her custody of custody of their children. Sorry, abusers move from victim to victim, and the legal system can become one more tool for their abuse. My nursing degree was from Turkey. Proved invaluable. Soon I was able to work as a nurse in the United States, but I always wanted to become a medical doctor, and recently I achieved that goal. I have also been certified sexual assault forensic examiner. Now I am providing medical care and advancing justice for other survivors. I have come full circle.
Wow. Thank you, Sebiye. Thank you so much for sharing this journey, and your experience highlights clearly how much young children, young girls can be pressured, can face, pressure from the family to protect the honor, right? That's one. And number two, how much the government that's supposed to protect victims become another perpetrator, and they fail to protect the victims. Thank you again. And we will have a follow-up questions for you.
Thanks.
Thank you. Okay, so the next question is for Jaha, Fraidy, and Jacqueline. So we have heard an amazing testimony from Kika and Sebiye. And each of you have a personal journey for survival from intersecting forms of gender-based violence. Could you each tell us what led you to where you are today? I'm going to start with Jaha, if she's here.
Hi, everyone. So my name is Jaha Dukureh, and I am the founder and executive director of Safe Hands for Girls, and also a survivor of both female genital mutilation and child marriage. I went through FGM when I was 1 week old, and I was brought to New York at the age of 15, where I met the amazing Taina Bien-Aimé, who's the only mother that I have in this world. And I lost my mother at a young age. And, she has been someone that has been there for me throughout my life and to this day, and introduced me to Sanctuary for Families. But I guess my story is not any different from the millions of girls who have experienced FGM, or the millions of girls who are forced to get married at such a young age. When I moved to New York, imagine being in a country that is very foreign to me, and not, after losing my mother and not knowing anyone in New York, and being undocumented, and having a family that didn't want me to get an education. It was just a lot of things that I was dealing with, and having a husband that was abusive, that would lock me inside the house, and a family that was super, super unsupportive. And I believe that it was a very scary period in my life. And I always tell people that I have very selective memory, because I feel like a lot of what I went through in New York is things that I've chosen to suppress, to where in a lot of it, I can't even remember most of it. But that was a choice that I made, that in order for me to survive this world and not be afraid of things, I needed to forget most of what happened. But there's not a thing that I haven't experienced in New York. I've slept in trains. I remember, I think one thing that I have never discussed is when I lived in New York, and I used to work at a restaurant called Africa Kine. It was one of the only African restaurants that was in Harlem. And at the time when I went there to apply for a job to be a waitress, the manager of the restaurant at the time, imagine, I think I was 16 at the time, but in order for him to give me a job, I every single day he would somehow try to either sexually harass me or abuse me. And I couldn't say anything because I needed that job in order for me to buy the clothes that I needed in order to go to school and some of the supplies that I needed. And luckily, having someone like Taina in my life, I feel that I wouldn't be alive today if it wasn't for her. I wouldn't be who I am if it wasn't for her, because unconsciously, I learned how to love myself through her. I learned how to believe in myself through her, and how to realize that I do have a purpose in this life. And a lot of what I went through, the purpose and my mission is to use my story in order to help other girls to not experience the same things that I went through, and be a voice for millions of girls. Because when you look at survivors of FGM, I remember, or even child marriage, one thing that Taina told me is, yes, every year we have CSWs, we have International Zero Tolerance Day against FGM, and we have all these events where we talk about these issues, but rarely do you see women like us being given the platform to tackle these issues for ourselves and be advocates for our communities, which is one of the reasons why I decided to move back to the Gambia and work with young people and lead the survival movement. But even that, it's still a huge challenge, because the world wants to hear our stories and plaster our pictures and faces everywhere and talk about how sad everything that we have been through, but who actually believes in us to actually allow us to lead that change? So for me, Taina has been that person. And every time I'm lost to this day, she's someone that I can turn to, someone that I can, honestly call and say, you know what, I'm struggling. And even if I'm in trouble, if I do something stupid, for instance, because of the things, I'm still very young, I'm 30, and I had to grow up very fast. Being someone's wife at the age of 15, this was a time when a lot of girls my age were in high school and doing things that normal girls do. But for me, I never had that opportunity. And when my first marriage failed, I managed to get a high school degree. And then my family arranged for me to get married again when I moved to Atlanta. And I stayed in that marriage for more than 10 years and had my kids. But even when I decided to leave that marriage as well, the emotional abuse, the psychological abuse, and the things that I went through in that marriage, I was threatened with my husband trying to take my children away from me. And when I managed to escape, I think a lot of people don't know this, but one of the reasons why I left the US wasn't because I wanted to leave the US. When I finally had help from Sanctuary to get asylum, and finally had my green card, and then finally went ahead and did my undergrad and then did my graduate degree. And at that point, I realized that I can stand on my own and I can protect my children. So in a way, I left the US to protect my kids. And you would think that America is the most free and most secure area, but I didn't feel safe when I was in the US. I didn't feel secure when I lived in the US. And I felt like, especially for my boys, the mentality and the people that they were around, and the misogyny and the things that they were being told about women, I knew that that wasn't healthy for them. And if I allowed them to watch me continue to struggle and continue to suffer under those circumstances, they would think that that is the normal thing to go through, and they would think that that is what is acceptable for them to treat women. So when I moved back to the Gambia with them, up until last month, I have been fighting for custody for my boys, and their father wanted to take them away from me. And some of the things that he says is that I'm a woman that can't stay married, and that I'm a prostitute, and that I'm someone who doesn't believe in God, and that I'm this. And the reason why the world celebrates me, or the reason why I know so many presidents, is because I'm an international escort that is doing all of these things. And they forget to realize that I didn't get to where I am today because of men. The people that helped me along the way are women. The people that opened doors for me are women. And for me, one of the hardest things that I deal with is not the fact that I've been through these violences, but it's the fact that I constantly have to defend myself as a woman. I have to defend my honor as a mother, and I have to explain why I'm fit to take care of my own children, and that my choice over a career to be an activist has nothing to do with me being wayward or me being this person that society should be embarrassed of. And it's still a challenge. I mean, people think that once you become liberated or once you become educated, that somehow you're still free from violence. But I feel like I'm more vulnerable to a lot of violences now more than ever. And these are things, whether I say it or not, that I continue to experience on a daily basis. And I think a lot of times is because of the psychological trauma and having things that I haven't truly dealt with. And that makes it hard for me to realize between what is real love and what is abuse and all of these things. And I think as women, we rarely get the platform to express ourselves in that way or even share our experiences in that way. So for me, I guess sharing my experience today as someone who has been through FGM, as someone who has been through child marriage, is to say that, you know, being through these things and being educated and ending up being who I am, like as I am sitting today, a lot of people see me as one of the most celebrated human rights activists, especially that came out of Africa. I became the youngest African to be nominated for the Nobel Peace Prize in 2018, Time magazine, all these accolades, all of these things that people think of me is very different from my daily struggles. I still have major anxiety. There are days when I can't leave my house when I think about a lot of the things that I've experienced that potentially I have never shared, because I don't want to feel like that person. I think to this day, one of the reasons why even sometimes when something is happening in my life, I stay quiet about it is because I don't want to be seen as that person that's always, something bad has to always happen to you. Eventually it goes like, because people don't want to see you as that girl that went to FGM, child marriage, domestic violence, rape, all of these things. So you would rather just stick to one thing so that you don't feel like your life is basically a continuous pain and that is never ending. But that is the reality for a lot of women. Just because you've been trafficked doesn't mean that you can't experience other forms of violences. And just because you've found a way out or you feel that you're secure doesn't mean that tomorrow something bad is not going to happen to you. And I think it's very, very important that we understand these things and we understand the intersectionality around these issues, and knowing that, you know, it doesn't matter that I'm African, that you know, I'm young or I'm American or I'm educated. To this day, bad things do happen to women just like us. And yeah.
Thank you so much, Jaha. And you know what you said when you start your presentation, that your experience may be similar to other girls and women. It's really the truth. And I'm amazed by your courage. And I think you spoke a lot about, you know, sometimes the fear, not wanting someone to know what you are going through because of the stigma in society, right? But I do think we're going to come back to that, because you said so many important things, highlighting the way you are today. It is from your own battle, your own struggle. Someone did not do this for you. So I see a lot of strength, I see a lot of resiliency, and I see a lot of determination from all of you. Thank you so much, Jaha. So the next speaker going to be Fraidy Reiss. Fraidy, you're going to have the same question as Jaha. I don't know if you want me to repeat it or not.
No, that's okay. Thank you. And so first, I just want to say, I mean, it's hard not to cry listening to the stories that we're hearing here today, but also so inspiring. And it just have so much love and respect for all these, my fellow panelists. And thank you so much for sharing your experiences and for doing something good out of it and bringing good to the world from your own trauma. For me, the gender-based violence all surrounded the forced marriage. I grew up in the ultra-Orthodox Jewish community in Brooklyn in New York City. And I think that, you know, to answer your question about the intersectionality with other forms of gender-based violence, I just want to explain all the other forms of gender-based violence to which I was subjected once I was, or through the course of being married off to a stranger when I was 19. So of course, forced marriage is a form of modern slavery and a human rights abuse. As a bride, I was also forced to undergo a virginity exam, a physical examination of my hymen to confirm that I was a virgin, as if that's a thing. I was also within my marriage required to have unprotected sex with my husband, which, required sex. I call it community rape. It was the community requiring me to have sex with this stranger. And it also meant a complete loss of all sexual rights and reproductive rights, which also meant forced motherhood. My first child was born 11 months after my wedding. Pretty soon I had two. I love my daughters, but that doesn't take away the fact that I was forced to have them, that was not my choice. Under religious law in that community where I was forced to marry, I also within marriage did not have any financial rights. I was allowed to work only if he allowed me, in which case anything I earned would belong to him. I was not allowed to have my own bank account or my own credit card. I also lost legal rights within the marriage. Under Orthodox Jewish law, a man is allowed to divorce his wife, but a woman does not have the right to divorce her husband. So he had the right to terminate our marriage. I did not. I also, within the Orthodox Jewish community within my marriage, I was considered unclean every time I menstruated, which was every month. And while I was unclean, not only was I not allowed to have any physical contact or sex with my husband, I had to sleep in a separate bed. I wasn't even allowed to hand him something or get undressed in front of him or sing in front of him. And then I was required to have 7 clean days where I did not have any blood before I could regain the right to be raped again. And during those 7 days, I was required to be sure that I wasn't bleeding at all. Twice a day, I had to take a white cloth and insert it up my vagina and swish it around and hold it up to the sunlight to be sure there was no blood on it. I also was required to wear white panties during those 7 days. And if there were any spots on the cloth or on the panties that I wasn't sure about, my husband would take the panties or the cloth to the rabbi to be checked. Which basically I just lost all rights to my own body and privacy. And by the way, the rabbi would keep my panties after he checked them. And then after the 7 clean days, I was required to go to the mikvah, the ritual bath, where I was required to strip naked in front of a stranger and to immerse in rainwater. Often that gave me a yeast infection, and that felt, I can tell you, every single month like a sexual assault. And then after that, I was required to go home and have non-consensual sex with my husband. And I was not allowed to shower between the 2 sexual assaults. And in my case, the forced marriage also meant, just classic domestic violence, because unfortunately, I discovered a week after my wedding that the stranger that I had been forced to marry also was violent and unstable. That was when he punched his fist through the wall in a blind rage, and a few days later threatened to kill me for the first time. And yet I was allowed no recourse. At one point we had moved to New Jersey, and I tried to get a temporary restraining order against my then husband after a very violent incident. The community, my entire family community, turned on me, and the rabbis sent an attorney with me to court to tell the judge that I wanted to drop the restraining order. When I finally managed, after 15 years, to escape from this abusive marriage, my family retaliated against me by shunning me. That's another form of honor violence. They still consider me dead. They declared me dead, and they still consider me dead. So I, because of this, founded Unchained at last to help others in the United States to escape forced marriages and to end child marriage, which so often is forced and still is legal in much of the United States. And we remain at Unchained at last the only organization dedicated to ending forced and child marriage in the US. And I can tell you from my experience at Unchained that the trauma and the various forms of gender-based violence that I experience are unfortunately not unique. This is the norm for those who experience a forced marriage here in the US.
Great. Thank you, Fraidy. And I see that it was so amazing to hear from you the way culture and religion are all used to perpetuate violence against women and girls. Thank you so much. I think I'm going to pass it to Taina for a few questions, then we come back to Jacqueline.
Okay, thank you. Now, Jacqueline, do you want to do you want to present now before the second question?
Happy to, whichever you feel is best.
Why don't you complete so that the audience has a whole overview of each of your amazing panelists?
Sounds wonderful. And I'm honored to be here with these amazing women. And thank you, Sanctuary, for inviting me to attend and giving us this opportunity to talk about all of these things. And what I'm going to talk about is something that we've heard from each of these amazing women talk about. And that's what happens, what I call chapter 2, what happens after you leave an abusive relationship and you end up in court. And this is the epidemic that was happening before the pandemic, and quite frankly, will last well after the global pandemic. And that crisis is what's happening in our family court system. And what happened to me, what happened to my daughter, Kyra, can happen to another child that you know or love unless changes are made. And like many people, I heard the messages to get out of an abusive relationship, to leave. But what we're not told is what happens once we do and once we end up in our family court system. And by the way, this problem is not just prevalent in the United States or in New York or in California or Florida or Texas. It's happening in the United Kingdom. It's happening in Australia. It's happening in Canada. It's happening in many nations around the world. And it needs to be addressed. And once you do leave a violent relationship, and if you have children, you are going to end up in family court. I ended up in family court. I left my abuser when I was just 6 weeks pregnant, and I left to protect my daughter, Kyra. And after being through family court for 28 months, this is what happened to my daughter, Kyra, who was a fiercely independent toddler, who loved Elmo and Mickey Mouse, who was really good about going down the slide fast, and who was really great at blowing bubbles. She was on a court-sanctioned, unsupervised visit with her abusive father, who shot her twice in the back while she slept. He then proceeded to pour gasoline all over his home. He killed himself in a murder-suicide. My daughter, Kyra, was only 28 months old. She deserves so much more from a court system that should have protected her. As I went through family court, and I, like many of you, the first time I walked into family court, thought if you raise your hand, you tell the truth, that the judge is going to protect your child. And as you heard from Kika and from others, when you get into family court, it's almost like you enter the twilight zone. The judges don't believe you, and they don't care what happens to your child, which is even more disturbing. And just to give you some glimpses into Kyra's custody case, when I walked into family court and I told the judge in Long Island, New York, which is where I'm from, that I was being stalked, I was being harassed, I was being threatened, that he was suicidal, and that Kyra was in jeopardy, the judge turned and yelled at me to grow up. Because of this judge, and by the way, it's not just this judge, it's all judges in family court. Because of the way our system is run, because of the way the judges are trained, my daughter, Kyra, will never grow up. We had Child Protective Services involved in Kyra's case, who noted that her father had anger and rage issues, an inability to care for my daughter, who was a baby at the time. And even though the power and control wheel was lighting up like a Christmas tree, they insisted that this was no domestic violence and labeled it low risk. I would like to know on what planet that's low risk. We had a mental health evaluator involved in Kyra's case. And here he had documented evidence, eyewitness accounts of the abuse. And here he labeled it that we should have joint custody of a child who's being abused by this man, because a father should always play a role in a child's life. Well, Kyra's father played a significant role in Kyra's life. He murdered her. An attorney for the child was appointed, and we should have this so that, Kyra should be protected. He refused to hear from other accounts. He refused to protect Kyra even 5 days before Kyra was murdered. He refused to get involved again when I begged him to do so. And at our last hearing, the judge, when I came forward with more evidence, said, this is not a life or death situation, quote unquote. Like you're hearing from everyone, when you end up leaving a domestic violence relationship and you end up in family court, you go to these institutions because they should protect your child. And it is like walking into the twilight zone. You don't understand what alternate universe you're in, and they're not protecting you. They're not believing you. And this is happening time and time again. And to give you an idea of how prevalent this problem is, when you look at the United States, 58,000 children each year are court ordered into the home of a parent who's physically, sexually, or emotionally abusing them. That means today there's 500,000 children who are terrified of the home that they're quarantined in. That's not okay. 70% of abusers are gaining custody of the children. 70%. Our courts are getting it wrong more often than they're getting it right. And when it comes to the child murders, these are happening far too often. And many of these are murder-suicides. And the actual technical term for these, by the way, is revenge annihilation. To do something like this, to leave me here without my daughter, is the ultimate form of revenge for an abuser. They're very prevalent in custody cases, but our courts are treating these like one-offs. And as you heard from the other women, these men become vengeful when we leave. And that's something that our courts are not accepting. Instead, they're holding on to this false narrative that all these women are vindictive and we're just trying to get back at someone. That's not the case. We're running to family court, hoping for sanctuary, hoping for help, hoping that you'll protect our children, and you don't. And what happens after you leave, abuse doesn't end. It gets worse. And we must change that. And why is this happening? Well, when you look at this, our courts are upside down. They're not following research. The thing I heard the most, well, just because he abused you doesn't mean he's going to abuse your child. On what planet does an abuser all of a sudden sit there and say, well, you know what? My son or daughter is now 18. All right, now I'll beat them. That doesn't happen. There are precursors, there are patterns to domestic violence. And unless you understand and you are skilled and well-trained in this, you are not going to understand the patterns of domestic violence. There are 2 major studies that are out there, one from the Department of Justice and one from the National Institute of Justice that looks at the custody cases and proves that our courts are getting it wrong, especially in the most dangerous scenarios, more often than they're getting it right. And when you look, by the way, just at sexual assault, if you come in and your child has been raped, you have an 81% chance of losing custody to your abuser. This is how backwards things are. Our courts favor the abusers and punish, especially mothers, for trying to protect their child. That cannot happen. When we go through custody cases, what you have to understand is we as women have already been gaslighted so much by society and even by ourselves that when we end up in court, we're not even sure if we've been abused sometimes, even though you've heard some of these awful stories. We're told that, we're too sensitive. Oh, he was having a bad day. We need to be more understanding. We put the rights of the abuser on a pedestal. And in court, we don't care about protecting the child. And if you are trying to protect your child, in family court today, you have a huge chance of losing custody. Kyra was murdered in July of 2016. Our case was going forward in October of 2016. And I can tell you today, I don't know if I would have remained in command of Kyra. I don't know if I would have retained residential custody of Kyra. I have a feeling it would have gone to her abusive father because I was trying to protect her. We have to stop this. And I'm very much looking forward to the next segment of this presentation when we start to talk about how we can go about making changes, because there are roads that we can take to protect our child, to protect women who are coming forward, and make sure that tomorrow is a brighter day.
Thank you so much, Jacqueline. Thank you, all of the panelists. And thank you, Jaha. I always welcome and cherish her words. I don't want to say that she exaggerates, because the suffering that both she and the others on this panel have shared with us, and the survival of it, really comes from each of your extraordinary resilience, your brilliance, your determination for this type of gender-based violence and discrimination not to happen to other women. And so we walk with you, and our job as advocates is really to support your resilience and your extraordinary intelligence and determination to end this scourge. So my next question is, the UN Secretary General has said that the violations against women are both universal and particular. Universal because, as we have heard, this is a global panel. There's not one country in the world where violence against women and girls doesn't occur with impunity. But it's particular because each of you have brilliantly showed that it is based on very particular religious, cultural, traditional patterns and practices at a global level, whether it's girl marriage or FGM or so-called crimes of honor, legal discrimination, the list goes on. Here we are at the virtual CSW65, when governments virtually are gathering together this year to reaffirm their investments in furthering the rights of women and girls. And we as civil society advocates telling them that they're not investing enough, and they're certainly not concerned enough toward the acceleration of change for the betterment of our lives. So my question to you is, it's clear women remain second-class citizens. To quote one of Professor Catherine McKinnon's books, the question is, are women human? As survivors, what do you think are the best solutions to offer governments and policymakers? Like, how can we, we've seen change, obviously, but what COVID-19 has shown us is how fragile those successes are. And so if you could each talk about your vision for the future, and also how can we get there? Thanks. And I'll start. Why don't I start with you, Fraidy, and then you can each go afterwards. Thank you.
Sure. Well, thank you for that question. And so I'll answer specifically about forced marriage and child marriage, since that's where my passion lies. And I can tell you that there are very few laws and policies in place in the United States that, to punish or prevent forced marriage. We need to do a whole lot better. We need to do the way, the UK, for example, does. They have both criminal and civil options for those who are interfacing a forced marriage. There's a national hotline people can call in a forced marriage situation. There's even a government task force that responds and helps individuals in that situation. We have none of that in the United States, and we need all of that. And in terms of child marriage can so easily be forced because children have limited legal rights until they turn 18. And there's, again, a very simple legislative solution that we at Unchained have been advocating for years now, which is most states already said 18 is the marriage age, but they have these really dangerous loopholes that allow marriage long before 18. In a lot of states, you can marry at any age, even a toddler legally could marry in many US states. And so we now lead this national movement to pass legislation in all 50 states, and at the federal level, no more marriage before 18, no exceptions. So far, 4 states have passed this legislation, so we have only 46 more states to go. The legislation right now is pending in 12 states. So I would urge all of you here today and care about this as much as I do, please visit unchained@last.org, find out what steps your state has taken, if you live in the U.S., to address forced marriage, to end and to end child marriage. I'm sorry, forced marriage. I'm sorry, is not even on anyone's radar yet. But see if your state has taken steps to end child marriage, and see how you can help to pass this important legislation.
Thank you, Fraidy. Just a clarification based on a question that just came in. We of course forgot to mention that there are sex-based rights and gender-based issues. And so what happened to each of you happened because you were born female. And so when we talk about gender-based violence, we should also remember that these are forms of violence and discrimination that are based on sex. So Sebiye, and then for me not to come back in and out. So after Sebiye, Kika, if you feel comfortable talking about solutions, and then Jaha, and then Jacqueline.
For me? Okay. Actually, women in traditionally societies faces severe obstacle to the equality, and the safety. Their government needs to recognize this. Ironically, the Istanbul Convention, now under attack by the president of Turkey and other conservative leaders around the world, provide an excellent roadmap for the government action. However, unfortunately, the Istanbul Convention named as such because convents took a place in Istanbul, and because Turkey was the first country to sign it, has been rescinded by the president. Our country has withdrawn from this agreement, leaving women with less legal protection than before. The good thing is that women across Turkey have immediately risen up and started demonstrating. We must support them. Perhaps in this act has mobilized the women of Turkey to go and force the changes. Education in general, as educated people can better understand the ramification of the government actions and how to strategically address them. And education about the value of the woman to society as a whole happens here in Turkey and every part of the world. This included rural areas that more traditional and societies with conservative and religious traditions. Each religion of the world can be forced and holding women back or for advancing our right. It depends on all the interpretation. Civil society must support religious leaders and religious teachings that promote women equality and oppose all the forms of the violence against women. They must oppose violence against women in all forms, including that carried by families defending their honor. They must explain that family honors are not based on daughter's virginity, but instead of based on education and supporting their daughters and helping girls and young women reach their full potential in every respect, including professionally and economically. Government must vigorously investigate all the sexual assault, including acquainted and date rape, and hold perpetrators accountable for the full extent of the law. The same holds true of the perpetrator of the domestic violence. It is often relatively small group of the men who are committing act of the violence against women. They often use different form of the violence against the woman, and move from one victim to other victim. They must be stopped. It can't be girl who has been raped, brought to dishonor her family, while the man who raped her is not viewed in the same light as bringing dishonor to his family. In fact, this is where the dishonor lies. Civil society plays an important role in ending misogynistic victim blaming once and for all. Violent men are responsible for the gender violence, not a woman and girls who suffer abuse. The public we must educate in school, in religion institutions, over the media, in the public spaces to support victims and survivors and stop abusers and their defenders from shifting the blame. Victim blaming is especially damaging the traditional societies. Honor killing is almost always a manifestation of the victim blaming. Government can stop honor killing by rejecting their explanation for their abuse and punishing the perpetrators and shifting stigma from victim to abuser. All over the world, battered women are in prison for defending their life and those of their children. Government must stop criminalizing abuse survivors who killed the man who battered, threatened, and traumatized them and their children. Each case with evidence that survivor was acting in self-defense or out of severe trauma when she killed her abuser to truly must be investigated. Police and prosecutors must decline to prosecute abuse survivor like a Melek Ipek, and government must pass the law that provide reduced sentences the victim on trial and incarcerated survivors. Finally, survivors of the gender violence deserve the best health care possible. They need high quality of the doctors, nurses, and mental health professionals who has been specially trained to treat trauma victims. And they need health insurance that makes excellent medical care possible. No survivor should be turned away from the medical care because she cannot afford it. This is my professional mission as a doctor. To summarize in my country, Turkey, President must immediately return to the Istanbul Convention, but not only do so, he must commit himself to enforcing the provisions that already exist to protect women, which have not really been the case. It is an adoption. All around the world, government must enact laws that protect women and their children and punish perpetrators of the violence against women in all its forms. Religion institutions must be engaged with the view to getting them understand that marriage should not be life sentence for the woman endure battering and other forms of the abuse. While education is a big budget in Turkey, it is estimated that as much as 35% of the girls in eastern and southern part of the country remain illiterated. I recently read that as many as 16 million girls in Turkey will never set foot in classroom for reasons that such as poverty, pregnancy, gender-based violence, and traditional attitudes of the role of the woman. It should be noted that Turkey had committed in Yale under the UN 2030 agenda for sustainable development to eliminating child early and forced marriage by 2030. What step has the government has taken to the end? Civil society and NGO community has a role to play here to educate women, girls within their sphere of the influence, to provide counseling, to provide provide retreat to battered women if government won't do so. It is all important to note that we are not likely to achieve the changes we want to see. We want to see if boys from an early age and men are not brought into the tent as well. The fight to achieve gender equality and end violence against the woman, not a battle that will be won tomorrow, but fought today with all the resources we can mobilize if we are made a better world for our daughters. Thank you for listening to me.
Hi, everyone. Just to follow up on that, I think as a community of women's rights advocate or people that believe in a more equal world, all of us need to be very honest with ourselves and we need to be very realistic with ourselves. I would give you the case of Senegal as an example. Recently, a young woman named Adji Sarr came out and said that one of the leading opposition leaders, Ousmane Sonko, raped her. The country went into mayhem, not in the defense of Adji Sarr, but in the defense of this man that allegedly raped her. And the whole country is constantly on TV insulting her and saying that she lied, and no one has given her the benefit of the doubt. But because he's a man, we are willing to give him the benefit of the doubt and say that it's political. I think as civil society organizations, as international development partners, as governments, as human beings, unless we are ready to put in supportive mechanism for these women that are coming out and sharing their stories with us and having the courage to speak out, unless we are willing to stand by them, unless we are willing to support them, then I think we should stop encouraging women to come out and tell us what happened to them. Because every time a woman comes out against a powerful man or even just a man, if that woman is deemed as someone who is paid to do it, or she's seeking attention, or she's doing it for all the wrong reasons, and a lot of us are just sitting on the side, not saying anything about that or helping to protect that young woman. I think when I look at the case of Senegal and Adji Sarr, for instance, one of the things that I realized is how her life has been ruined. And the fact that no one is out there giving her a helping hand. All of us that are here, we can build a coalition where we stand by Adji Sarr unless we are proven wrong. But I don't think civil society, I mean, we have all these conversations wherein we talk about solutions, we talk about policies, we talk about all of these things, but what are we actually doing to be each other's keepers? I mean, people like me, I think someone like me can say that I'm very fortunate because I have someone like Taina in my life, but not every woman has access to that. And I think as women's rights group, we need to do better. For me, that's my vision for the future. We need to work with a little bit more integrity. We need to work with a little bit more support for these survivors and these victims, because without any of that, all of this is a waste. I mean, you had the Millennium Development Goals. We're talking about CSW, that is a UN event. And then for I don't know how long they couldn't achieve the Millennium Development Goals. And now we're talking about the Sustainable Development Goals. How are we going to achieve zero FGM by 2030? How are we going to achieve zero child marriage or forced marriages by 2030? And all of these things, that policies and these things that we are talking about, if it's not connected to work that is happening on the ground or the people that are actually impacted by it, people that have the biggest solutions are the women that have the lived experience, as well as have the community expertise and know-how to tackle these issues. And unless we are willing to invest with them, unless we are willing to partner with them, unless we are willing to trust them and see their capabilities rather than seeing them just as victims, we are not going to get anywhere. And every year, we're just going to be here sitting around round tables. Some of us that are very privileged that can't travel to New York and sit at the UN. I mean, I'm a UN ambassador. But nevertheless, it's time that we are very, very honest with ourselves and say the way that we've approached this hasn't been effective. And we need to seriously dig deep internally and realize that there's been a problem with our approach, and think about how do we start approaching this from a holistic place, from a place that is more authentic, from a place that thinks about these women more, rather than just, hearing these stories, because we know that these things happen. And we're tired of repeating ourselves. We're tired of telling the world how painful FGM is or how painful child marriage is. And the fact that forcing a girl to marry someone against her will is the same as raping her over and over again. We've said these things over and over again. The whole world has heard us. So there's no shortage of information that is out there, but action and investing and putting our money where our mouth is what we need to do. So thank you for having me. Thank you, Taina. Thank you, Mariama. Thank you, Sanctuary. I'm honored to be part of this, but I really want to see change when it comes to the women's movement. I really, I'm hungry for that.
Thank you, Jaha. Jacqueline and Kika, did you want to add anything?
I want to talk about my perspective based on my experience. I want to say that sexual abuse in childhood and domestic violence as a teenager traumatized girls and groomed them for trafficking. That's just based on my experience. That is what happened to me. Government and civil society must prevent this abuse on girls and young women. They can do this by educating children in early daycare centers and school about bad touching and the right to ownership of their bodies. They must educate boys and men about the responsibility to respect boundaries of girls and women and refrain from any sexual contact with minors. And they can also educate the parents to believe children when they report sexual abuse. My mother didn't believe me, and that hurt me so much. Government must enforce criminal penalty against all child as sex offenders. Child sex abusers don't just prey on one child. They hurt victim after victim. And they set up victims for future abuse like me. They must be stopped and punished. All government, and I'm gonna reinforce this, all government must take this criminal justice priority. Government must pass and enforce strong laws against sex traffickers, against pimp, against sex buyers. I'm proud to say that I helped lead the campaign for the first anti-trafficking laws in New York. I helped the legislative understand how the sex industry operates, how traffickers like Danielle, pimps like his cousin Sandra, and the sex buyer like my ex-husband all work together to destroy lives of vulnerable girls and women like me. I got out, rebuilt my life, but so many other women and girls did not survive. I think about them every day. And I always gonna talk about police. The police corruption enabled the sex industry to make more and more profit, attracting new traffickers every day, pimps and buyers. It must be stopped. The police must be carefully screened so abusers like my ex-husband do not end up in the police force. Police force. The police officer must be trained in about harm done by sex industry, and they must be close monitored. So any officer who engaged in any sex buyer or harass prostitute women are arrested and fired. And I'm talking about this is because it's very dear to me. When I was trafficked, most of the police, they came to the places, they use us and to be served and be served to them. And when they didn't come to be served, they came to arrest us. So they were not there to support us. They were us to also hurt us in our deal on us being trafficked. Immigrant trafficking victim like me, especially need special protection and assistance. They need free and highly skilled lawyers like Sanctuary for Family. And they need laws that enable them to vacate prostitution conviction and criminal conviction like I did have. That made my life a little bit hard when I was trying to rebuild my own life and obtain green card and citizenship. They also need, and I apologize, they also need public benefits, even before they documented, so they don't need to sexual exploitation survive. So many girls, they try to flee the sexual servitude, they ended up going back because they don't have a way to survive. They don't have a way to go over their life and rebuild their own lives. So the only thing that they know is sell themselves. So to prevent that to happen again, they need to provide service for those young women for them to be able to survive and rebuild their own life. Finally, trafficking survivors suffer severe psychological trauma like I have. The multiple forms of gender violence must be endured from early childhood, take terrible toll on their mental health like it happened to me. They need excellent trauma therapy like I have through Sanctuary for Family. The children of trafficking survivors also suffer trauma and need physical and mental therapy. Government and society can prevent sex trafficking and prostitution and break the cycle of violence. Survivor leadership can guide them in achieving this important goal. I sat on the stage of the United Nations in New York and in Geneva, and to educate our world leaders about the true form of trafficking and prostitution. I'm so honored to join other survivor leadership to continue to speak that truth. I want to say thank you to Sanctuary for Family for being there in my life to help me through all the process that I had endured. And also I want to say thank you to Taina because Taina always was there in the beginning too. I want to say thank you to everybody that listened and to those that want to help us fighting human trafficking and child abuse and any gender violation. I want to say that I'm honored to be here and to listen to all the stories about all the different violence that we endure as girls and women. And thank you for being there to support us. Thank you, Ms. Dorshin. I'm in eternal gratitude. Without Dorshin, I don't think that I will be here today. Thank you.
Thank you, Kika.
Thank you, Kika, for your courage.
Thank you for your courage.
I'd like to,
go ahead, Jacqueline. Yes, please.
I'd like to jump in, and we're talking about all of these problems and the intersections and how complicated and complex they are. When I look at family court and what can be done, the solutions are actually simple. And there are child safety and making sure our children are safe and that women are protected. That's not complicated. That's something that we can do, that we can attain, but it's up to us. It's up to all of us, not just the panelists, not just Sanctuary for Families, not just me, but everybody who's out there to come together and work together to bring about changes. And how do these changes form? First, with policy and legislative changes. Second, we need to believe victims, something that Kika was just talking about. And we need to be talking about this more, like some of the other incredible women we're just talking about. Let me jump into policy and legislative changes. Since Kyra was murdered 4.5 years ago, I became an advocate. And I'm very proud to sit here and tell you today that changes are on the cusp of happening. Change is about to become a reality with your help. 2 years ago in Congress, I'm very proud to tell you that we passed a congressional resolution to make child safety the top priority when you go through custody cases in divorce and family court. This was the first time in 30 years that Congress actually came together to discuss and vote on this. This was a huge change. And that has sent a huge message to the states that we need to wake up and we need to do things better. And since then, I've been working with legislators in New York State to bring about a series of bills to better protect children. And I'm very happy to tell you that there are champions, there are wonderful people in New York State who recognize that the dire need for change, that this is critical. I've even had legislators talk to me and say, this is more important than the other legislative initiatives that I'm working on, and this must be a first priority for them. And in New York State, we have 4 bills that I'm hoping to make a reality. And the first one, I'm happy to say, is named after my daughter, Kyra. I'm honored about that. It's called Kyra's Law. And what Kyra's Law is going to do are a few critical things. First of all, it's going to make the health and safety of the child the top priority in a child custody case. Something that's common sense, but not happening in reality. The other thing that Kyra's Law is going to do, it's going to mandate judge training around family violence, child abuse, and trauma. Our judges are not well trained. They don't understand the dynamics. They don't understand the patterns. They are making life and death decisions every single day and are not equipped to do so. We need to change that. And finally, what Kyra's Law will do is make sure that these common abusive practices that we heard from many of the panelists, that when you go in front of family court, your children are taken away from you. We need to stop that. We need to make sure that their children are staying with their protective parent and not going to their abuser. And Kyra's Law stops many of those practices. And in the chat, for those of you who are out there, if you are from New York, I'm going to ask you to copy this link and email your legislators. It's a simple, easy thing to do. It takes 30 seconds, and ask them to support Kyra's Law. There are 3 other bills, like I mentioned. One is to advance supervised visits to make sure we're protecting children from abusers after custody has been determined. A third addresses these mental health evaluators, the one that I mentioned in Kyra's case, who recommended joint custody and who ignored all of the evidence. Make sure that they're trained. And the 4th bill will stop some of the violations of due process that's out there that actually hurts women who have been abused. There is a path for change on the horizon, but it's up to us to do all of this. The other thing that we have to do is we have to be talking about this. And we have to make sure, what happens with domestic violence, what happens with child abuse, this all happens behind closed doors. Abusers wear masks. The way that they are in public is vastly different from the way that they are when the doors are closed. And we need to recognize that. We need to talk about it. We need to not make this, oh, we don't want to talk about it. The thing I hear the most from people is, this is hard to talk about. Well, imagine us, imagine me, I'm living this. I'm living in a world without my daughter because we don't talk about this. So be vocal about this. Don't be ashamed about this. This is happening too often. And the final piece that is absolutely critical, and Jaha was talking about this in her remarks, we have to believe victims. Each of us are up here on this panel today, and it's not easy coming forward and talking about this. It hurts, it's painful. And I don't do this for myself. I do this so that the next child doesn't get hurt and harmed. And I see a change on the horizon, and I'm going to go after that. But we need to believe victims when they come forward and make sure that we stand in solidarity with them when they do. Don't question them, stand right by with them, because that's the way that we're going to bring about change for Kyra, for everyone who's on this panel who has gone through the horrible things, and for your children who have experienced this as well. We can change this. We can make change a reality. It is not complicated when we employ common sense and we work together.
Thank you, Jacqueline. Unfortunately, we are nearing to the end of this panel. We won't be able to take any questions, and for the audience, we are really sorry about that. I see there are a few questions there, but we won't have that time. But I'm going to introduce Tatiana Tocliarento, who will be doing the closing remark. Thank you. I don't know if she's here. Okay,
Thank you so much, Mariama. Can you see and hear me?
Yes, I see you.
I'll keep this short as we have time. But I would like to start by thanking the panelists for their courage and commitment and leadership in combating various forms of gender-based violence. At the OSCE Office for Democratic Institutions and Human Rights, survivors' voices, we believe, are essential in addressing and leading the development of all work, policy, legislative, and work on the ground, and ensuring that these issues are reflective of their experiences and are addressed to ensure restorative survivorship. Last year marked the 25th anniversary of the adoption of the UN Beijing Declaration seeking to advance women's rights and gender equality around the world. But as has been mentioned by every panelist here, we are far from achieving gender equality. The commitments made by the international community in the Beijing Declaration and Platform for Action in 1995 remain as relevant as ever today in light of the COVID-19 pandemic, and genuinely require political will and resources to achieve these goals now. The impact of the COVID-19 pandemic felt by women and girls are multifaceted. The pandemic exacerbated and exposed already existing gaps in effectively tackling gender-based violence. It has also exacerbated pre-existing socioeconomic inequalities and has brought to the light the gender discrimination and harmful social norms that sustain violence against women and girls. These have not only been exacerbated during this crisis, but also are putting all the progress that has been made in the last few decades at risk. As highlighted in today's parallel event, gender-based violence is occurring in intersecting forms and must be combated and addressed in multifaceted ways. The outbreak of the COVID-19 pandemic has led to the exacerbation of vulnerabilities of gender-based violence, further exhibiting the violence against women and girls, which sits in the continuum of manifestation of violence based on gender norms, assumptions, and stereotypes around male domination, sexual entitlement, coercion, and control. Now more than ever, states have to take responsibility for achieving a gender equal world, review their international and national obligations. Just drawing on a few conclusions from a recent ODIHR and UN Women guidance on addressing emergent human trafficking trends and consequences of the COVID-19 pandemic, I would like to share some recommendations to states that we have shared as well before. In the context of the COVID-19 pandemic and the exacerbation of gender inequalities, it is ever more essential that the language and goals of SDG Goal 5, as well as Target 8.7 and 16.2 are prioritized in their implementation. Governments must implement effective and impact-oriented gender mainstreaming in all migration policies post-pandemic, as women and girls are particularly vulnerable to gender-based violence in the context of migration. Drawing from the prevention of violence field, incorporate work on changing harmful masculinities and social norms that promote the codification and objectification of women and children, and promote the idea of men's entitlement to women's bodies in order to reduce demand for trafficking for the purpose of sexual exploitation and other forms of gender-based violence. Now more than ever, states must ensure compliance with the obligations under Article 9.5 of the Palermo Protocol to discourage the demand that fosters all forms of exploitation that lead to trafficking. In particular, the demand that fosters sexual exploitation should be targeted for prevention and criminal justice measures. And finally, states must address the nexus between online violence, women's objectification in the media, and its linkages to pornography, including trafficking for the purposes of pornography production and child sexual abuse materials, And with that, I also want to recognize Sanctuary for Family and Coalition Against Trafficking in Women for all of their efforts in putting this event together, and leave on the note that survivors are not just their stories, but so much more than that. But the stories that you've heard here today are stories, not just their stories, but stories of many women around the globe. And we should all come together, both on an international level and local levels, to really address all of the gender-based violence issues discussed here and others that have not been discussed. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much for everything, especially for Dorchan.
Thank you, Sebiye, Fraidy, Jacqueline, Kika, and where's my girl Jaha, who probably left already. This was amazing, and we are so sorry to the audience that we weren't able to get to all your questions. There was one question though that I think we should probably ponder on. Many of you have talked about education and how critically important it is to move forward on recognizing women and girls as full human beings, among other things. Would it be helpful, and this is food for thought, if we put male violence before all of our categories, whether that would accelerate a recognition of who's doing the battering and the harm, and who are the victims that are suffering with impunity? And so with that, I leave it to Mariama. And again, thank you so much, Mariama, and everyone at Sanctuary for Families for working so hard on this panel. And to all the panelists, you are truly inspiring and brilliantly amazing. Thank you.
Thank you all. Thank you to all the amazing speakers we have had today. Thank you, Tatiana, and nice meeting you. I have to thank Hannah and her team who really put this Zoom call together, and I hope we're going to stay in touch. There have been many questions and your recommendations are amazing, fascinating, and I encourage you. And I'm sure there are many people out there who really want to join this movement to bring changes. Hopefully by the time we next year, when we meet for the CSW again, we will see some success, although there are some challenges, as Jaha was mentioning, and some of you. But thank you all. Enjoy your afternoon, and we stay in touch. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye.
Bye.